Dear Bethany, thank you for having you again. Last time we spoke in November 2020 about the economy of Mamluk state, and this time we're going to talk more about the urban life in the biggest centers of Mamluk Empire, namely Cairo and Damascus. Do we have enough evidence, primary sources, about the urban life in Damascus, for instance?
Yeah, actually, we do. The last time you and I spoke for this forum, it was on rural economy mostly, and that's tricky to reconstruct because we don't have the written sources, so many, and we really have to rely on the archaeological record. When it comes to the cities, we're very lucky. These texts are largely generated by scholars who lived in the big cities. They're generated for the state, so our documentary sources are the product of bureaucrats that are living and seated in Damascus and in Cairo and Jerusalem and Aleppo and cities like that. So they really give us an insider's view on life in the city. Now, there's a caveat to that. This is life in the city for a certain group of people. So this is city life seen through the eyes of the intellectual elite. They're scholars. They're scholars and bureaucrats. It's how they see the world. They write about the things that concern them and their pocketbook and their families' lives and their careers. And so when they do describe the lower classes and the masses in the urban centers, it's done so through their prism. And that's something that we need to remember. Fortunately, we also have, in addition to written records, art. And that really supplements our picture of life in the cities, because we have, believe it or not, in Islamic art, we do have a lot of pictorial forms that show us how people ate, what banquets looked like. They show us some popular scenes of people getting together for public recitations of poetry and things like that. So if you combine the texts and the and artistic depictions, we have a pretty nice, intimate view of life in the city for a certain group of people.
And of course, we're talking about the time span from 1250 until the Ottoman occupation, which occurred in 1517. We, of course, have lots of biographies, inscriptions, travelogues, descriptions of towns, administrative manuals, diplomatic correspondence, works of art, and artistic evidence. How that society was stratified, because we had in Mamluk cities categorization based on political and economic and social belonging to a certain group, more or less involved with the Mamluk dynasty. Mamluk dynasty tended to absorb elements of noble families that already existed during the Ayyubid and pre-Ayyubid times. What can we say about the city life in Cairo and Damascus during Mamluks?
Okay, if you're looking at social stratification, I guess we can simplify it from the perspective of the people that are working for the state. There's two groups of people. There's the ruling elite, and there's everybody else that pays the taxes to financially support the ruling elite. From a state perspective, there's nothing more to society. That's it. So for the masses, that's everyone that is not Mamluk, not in a position of political or military power. Ultimately, one's position in society can be defined by one's relationship to state officials. That's why the intellectuals or the scholars, the ulama, are so important in this perspective. Not only whatever we know about daily life in the cities comes through them and through what they pen. It's also reflects how they see the world vis-a-vis their position with state officials. Those are that are positioned well, that are married into the ruling elite, and Mamluk families, after Mamluks are emancipated from slavery, they can marry, and they often marry into this particular socioeconomic class, the class of scholars. And it's measured by that, and also patronage. Who gets paid to write chronicles, biographies, royal biographies, that sort of thing? Who's on the payroll of the state as judges or managers of madrasas and religious endowments, awqaf, and that sort of thing. So yeah, you have the taxpayers, you have the state officials, but within the taxpayers, that stratification is generally defined by one's position to the state authority. And within that, you've got professional classes, classes of merchants, of scholars, of uh, uh, popular leaders. You've got gang leaders, popular preachers, those that don't have, that are not receiving any kind of stipend from the state, but have popular authority. There are uh, technicians and people that are working in masters in workshops, ceramic workshops, in bakeries that have small businesses, and women are involved in this kind of thing as well. And then you have the masses of poor. And there have been some wonderful, wonderful books written about particularly Cairo's urban poor in the Mamluk period. And yes, we can say a lot about the poor. Again, they enter the written record through the whatever captures the attention of the scholars. And the scholars often have direct contact with the poor because they're administering charity. They're condemning them, the poor, for doing things that are not middle class proper, that break with formal religious law and various sorts of things. So the poor become visible to us in very strange ways in the written record. So it's a complicated society in that sense. Then you've got neighborhoods that have their own walls, that have gates, that keep curfews at night. Those neighborhoods are based on religious communities. So if you look at a city like Cairo, Muslims, Jews, Christians living together in different quarters, with their own cemeteries as well. You've got what's left of tribal groups and clans that are still visible in the physical fabric of the cities too, and they live in different areas. So it's really socially diverse, very rich. And it can be, you can reconstruct this through the written record, but from a state perspective, there's simply those that pay the taxes and those that eat the income from those taxes.
Were these groups ossified, or there was some kind of fluctuation between them so people could progress within the Mamluk society? And when you refer to scholars, you probably refer to theological authorities, sheikhs, and different religious scholars who, like Ibn Taymiyyah, operated in Mamluk period.
Well, if you need social mobility,
yeah. What was the social mobility, or the society was ossified?
There is social mobility, but not in the sense that we think of it. And yes, education played a role in that. But let's talk about the scholars first. Most of the scholars that we think of for the Mamluk period came from families of scholars. So his father was a member of the ulama, and his father's father was a member of the ulama, and so on and so forth. And many of these positions in madrasas in the court got passed down father to son to grandson. And those family networks were reinforced. Some of these men could travel from city to city and get appointments in other places. That's true. Did people from non-elite, non-scholarly families, could they make a career? let's put it in terms of academia. Could they make an academic career? Yeah, they could. And some of the most beautiful examples of that come to us from what's today Jordan, where we've got names of scholars from villages. We know they came from villages. We know they were born in farmers' families, and yet they were able to, they went to local madrasas, they studied, they got the certifications they needed, and then they were able to make careers in larger places, eventually moving on to Damascus, Jerusalem, and Cairo. And that happened among sort of the lower classes in the larger cities too. It was possible. Was it common? Probably not. Again, most of these scholarly families were families. And you went through the ranks because of your father's and your father's father's networks. It was these academic networks that got you jobs. As far as making money and doing investment, it's very interesting to see how things change, let's say from the late 14th century on. Uh, all I could say is that maybe it's a good thing that the state was going bankrupt, because the Mamluks started selling off their assets. And when they did so, they sold them off in small pieces. And that meant that if you could come up with the cash to buy it, right? You could buy land, you could buy properties, you could buy businesses. And small shop owners were able to do this and build larger businesses in the cities. And we see that rural people were able to do that too. Some of them were rural scholars, some of them were rural shop owners, some of them were simply farmers that were able to get access to credit, and they started buying up more land. That became a venue of social mobility at the very end of the Mamluk period. It was modest, it wasn't incredible wealth, but still it's a notable difference than what came from before. So yeah, there was mobility in that sense. Mobility through the military ranks. So the way that the Mamluk system worked is that in its pure form, if it ever existed really in a pure form, we understand it that slaves were purchased from abroad, young men at a certain age, preferably preteen, 9 to 11. They were brought to Cairo. They were trained as soldiers. Eventually, they were emancipated, but they stayed in the military for their whole lives. And that was a venue, a real venue of social mobility, economic mobility for these men. And they can move through the ranks. If they were very clever at forming ties with higher level officers and with the Sultan himself. And it was a lot of maneuvering. You know, are you politically savvy or are you not? And young soldiers, they learn to do this fairly quickly and efficiently. So you could move through the ranks. Now, if you weren't supposed to enter the Mamluk Corps unless you were purchased as a slave. So the back door to this is that if you wanted your son to have an opportunity, you could simply sell him to the slave merchants, and that way he would get an opportunity. The Ottomans did the same thing with the Janissaries.
Yes, I wanted to mention Janissaries, but
yeah.
you drew the parallel which I was planning to mention, that Mamluks are similar to the concept of Janissaries that were the states within the states during the Ottoman Empire until the...
Yeah, the difference with the Janissaries is that was a form of tax collection. So there were certain parts of the Ottoman Empire, that tax wasn't levied everywhere, the devshirme, but it was in certain parts. And we know this, let's say, from the European areas of the Ottoman state. And so many young men had to be recruited locally, and often it was the local community that decided which one of them then would be sent to the Ottoman authorities.
In the beginning, they were Christians. They were recruited from the Christian populations within the Ottoman Empire, but later on Muslims were also allowed to join Janissaries. So it became more popular and they grew in number in the later stages. Also, what I wanted to ask is, since Arabs adopted the late Byzantine and Sasanian imperial institutions to their own uses. And also we can go back into the Middle Eastern civilizations in pre-Islamic era, how it merged with Arab Muslim cultural values and identity. Because we have a continuation of these civilizations in the Levant, in the Middle Eastern cities, which dates back to pre-Islamic and pre-Christian times. We're talking about now Islamic type of Middle Eastern urban society and how it differed from Middle Eastern non-Islamic type of the urban society.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. Normally, one turns to the history of institutions in order to disentangle what is uniquely local and pre-Islamic and borrowed into the medieval Islamic governing system. The kinds of things you could talk about are recruiting of soldiers, are categories of taxes, how taxes are collected, what they're used for. The one institution we tend to think of as uniquely medieval Islamic is the endowment system, the Waqf, Waqfiyat, for the endowment documents. And the way that it is run, it has a very specific history in the history of Islamic finance. That's true. But there are parallels to it in the charitable system of endowments in the Christian world, namely the Byzantine Empire. And to what degree that had an impact on the Islamic world, I really can't say. I'd say more that these are parallel developments and that the endowment system in Islam is uniquely tied to the history of um, let's say military pay, for example, limits on passing down your iqta to your children. If there wasn't the iqta system and the Mamluk system, you wouldn't have the Waqf system being so widespread in the Mamluk world. In other words, all of these financial systems relate to one another. It's a complicated mix. The fact that Mamluk soldiers were not allowed to bequeath their property to their sons because they were brought into the system as slaves and their sons are freeborn, they're not entitled to inherit from them. The Waqf system was kind of a backdoor to that. So what starts off as a system of charity becomes something very different. And that is uniquely Islamic because it relates to financial systems that you don't see in the same form in other parts of the world that are non-Muslim. In terms of social structure, I don't think that if you were a traveler, if you were a merchant and you were going all over the Mediterranean from parts of the Christian world, even to the pagan world and parts of Africa to the Muslim world, I don't know that you would see that the structures of cities are necessarily so terribly different. There's an urban form that develops that just seems to be uniquely suited to the kind of trade, maritime trade that dominated this part of the world in the Middle Ages. But these institutions, governing institutions, financial institutions, legal institutions, do have a different form and they function a little differently. And I'd like to add one other thing too. It was fascinating to me when I started working with Waqfiyat, with endowment documents, and most of my historical research has to do with those kinds of documents because they're so rich. Even for an archaeologist, they give you all of this detail of land and people and resources and relationships of places to each other. But what shocked me is the degree to which Christians turned to the Sharia courts to form their own endowments. So Christians used Muslim courts for a variety of reasons, and for the issue not so much of inheritance, but for For endowment of property and for charity, Christians use Muslim courts quite frequently. We see that in the 14th and 15th century in Cairo, certainly.
These Christians maintain monopolies in different trades during Mamluk reign. We are witness these days that they have a monopoly on production and distribution of alcoholic beverages. And according to primary sources, they enjoyed a similar autonomy back in Mamluk period.
Yeah. You see in the business sector and even in the government sector, much more involvement of Christian and Jewish communities in the Fatimid period. And things really changed in the Ayyubid and Mamluk. And many historians, and I think they're probably right, would argue that the real increase in conversion to Islam is a much later development in terms of the numbers of people, and that large numbers of Christians in particular, like in Egypt, began to convert in the Ayyubid and Mamluk period. And so they're there, they're active, but they're not listed as Christian anymore. They're not Christian, they're Muslim now. So we don't get so much a notion that they're involved in certain industries the way they were in the Fatimid period when they're still registered as Christians, right? But in terms of their activities in the Mamluk period, yes, they were involved in within their own communities, within their own trade networks, selling of wine, for example.
Yeah.
That industry never died. And there were attempts by Mamluk sultans to put an end to it. Often soldiers would go into the medieval equivalent of a winery or of a bar, and they would just smash jars in an effort to cleanse neighborhoods. But that happened every once in a while. The wine was supposed to be sold to other Christians, and that's kind of how it worked. Raising of pigs was in the hands of Christian farmers. And again, that was supposed to be, it was for their own communities. And in terms of what monopolies that we have in the Mamluk period that are industrial, these are state monopolies, and they're solidly in Muslim hands. The sugar industry, silk industry, many aspects of textiles and weaving, those are state controlled. Yeah.
We can say that during Mamluk period we had some attempts to impose the prohibition.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah,
but
like
it's irregular, and
yeah,
it is. But it wasn't once; it was several times, and it was always a kind of ad hoc and just kind of at the whim of a particular sultan. And if he was listening to the advice of a particular cleric or not, and it never really had staying power. So you'd have a lot of these, that's a good parallel, efforts at prohibition throughout the Mamluk period. Always short-termed, never lasted for very long.
What can we say about a criminal network that existed in big urban centers? We learned about Zuaras in Damascus, for instance, and they were very important factor in local feud. Sometimes their importance was beyond the city or beyond the quarter in which they operated. What can we say about Zuaras? Who were
I'm
Zuaras?
not the one to. I haven't written on them. The person that has is an American scholar historian. I love his work. His name is Carl Petrie, and he wrote a wonderful book a few years ago about gang violence and criminality in Mamluk cities. And he makes this distinction between crime in Cairo and crime in Damascus, and who was responsible for what, and how the authorities put an end to it or didn't, or even colluded in criminal activity. And the picture that is painted by the chroniclers, that is the Mamluk historians, these are chronicles of the period, is that the Damascus crime scene was the result of very well organized gangs. These are youth gangs, like any modern city. And they had their turf and they controlled certain neighborhoods. And this kind of criminality emerges when you've got a weak state and a weak police force. And in the late Mamluk period, this was the case. Most of this criminality was aimed against the governor of Syria, who just sort of absorbed everyone's hatred.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, for reasons good and bad and justified and unjustified. But these gangs were a state within a state, and they became an authority, and people were as kind of like the mafia. People were as afraid of them as they were the Mamluk authorities, the Mamluks policing the street and the state itself. And what really empowered these youth gangs, I suppose, is their goals were twofold. One was plunder. I mean, it was just like mafia. There was a financial side to it, to be able to have a monopoly over businesses, and they had a stranglehold over the marketplace. That's clear. The other thing was often in retaliation to state policies against their own perceived interests. These youth gangs were often joined by Mamluks themselves, Mamluk soldiers. So that's the Damascus scene. As far as organized crime in other places, it's more the actions in Cairo were told of the civilian mob and soldiers whose pay was in arrears. They hadn't been paid their salaries for a while. They didn't get what they thought that they had coming to them. And in the countryside, the tribal networks were the kind of the rural version of the youth gangs. The tribes have very, very strong ties in Egypt and Bilad Asham. And they became a source of pressure on the state authority. And I don't just mean Bedouin, I mean tribal networks within villages too. But the story of these youth gangs in Damascus, it's rich. And to what degree there's collusion with soldiers is fascinating too.
For our viewers, I can recommend the book Muslim Cities in the Late Middle Ages. It's written in late 60s, early 70s, and the book also deals with urban life and urban gangs. And of course, crooked military servicemen who, due to unpaid wages or all kinds of reasons, joined these urban gangs. And we have this situation in modern urban centers in different countries. So we can easily relate to.
Yeah, it's shocking how modern it is.
It is very modern.
You're reading about the Middle Ages, but it's so modern.
Yes.
And that book is a classic. It is a beautiful, beautiful read.
What was the role of emirs in the urban communities? What extraordinary powers enabled leading Mamluk emirs to play an important role in the communal and religious life of the towns, particularly Damascus and Cairo, Jerusalem and Aleppo?
Yeah, they were able to transform their professional and political power into financial power, and that's when they became players in local society. So emirs were the ones that were the most active in some of these business monopolies that we just talked about, the sugar industry, weaving, and particularly the silk workshops. And that gave them incredible wealth. Now, let's keep in mind, a Mamluk is not legally allowed to pass on his wealth to his children. So what he ended up doing is donating these kinds of businesses to charitable purposes and making his family members the managers of those businesses. And that's kind of a backdoor to inheritance. And it worked quite well. And then the family could build up a family network of wealth and power on that basis too. The emirs got, at some point in the Mamluk period, really involved in local society. And they started rubbing shoulders with just regular people, which is kind of interesting. Yes, they intermarried into the class of the ulama, the scholars, but they also had the opportunity to meet people that were not part of the scholarly class. And what happens mainly in the 15th century is something very interesting. This mixture of rich and poor, that division kind of breaks down, and you see the wealthy class and empowered class and the masses start to mix. They mix during the Maulid celebrations many of them in Cairo took place in the city cemetery, the Qarafa. But they mix at poetry readings, at literary circles where you'll see emirs and tradesmen, masons, for example, and architects, and interested people of the community that are of lesser means attending these same circles of literature. A new form of literature emerges in the 15th century that's kind of like yellow journalism. It's popular literature, romance stories, and trash novels, and in colloquial language. And for anyone that knows Egyptian colloquial, that literature is amazing because it's just like people are talking to you. It's in regular colloquial Egyptian colloquial Arabic. And everybody read that literature of different classes. So the class system, I wouldn't say it actually breaks down, but there's a meeting of people on a popular level more than ever before. And I think that that's more vivid in Cairo probably than any other city. So the emirs then can, if they're clever, gain some popularity among the population because the people get to know them a little bit. And then emirs start to get involved and interfere in the local community. They take on themselves the aura of being religious authorities all of a sudden. And so they'll comment on what is a proper lifestyle and what's not. The emirs they really were this central pin that kind of tied everything together and brought the political elite in line with the local communities. And it's more than anything else, it's their family relationships with the clerics. They intermarried, they had common business interests, and they had friendship groups. Really interesting, and that becomes textually visible to us in the 15th century.
Many of Mamluk children became religious scholars or religious notables in different schools of Sunni Islam. That's one of the results of intermarriages between Mamluks and local notables.
Another side to that is that many clerics then became farmers because they were able to use the relationships they have with the emirs to buy land. And so people that were religious scholars fancied themselves gentlemen farmers. And the sons of emirs then became, not only did they become scholars, some of them became craftsmen, and that's interesting. Artists and artisans. There was a guild system in the Middle Ages in the Islamic world like there was in Christian Europe. And the guilds worked, they did to standardize product production and maintain standards, but the guilds were initially a way for the state to collect taxes from businesses. What happens with these guilds in the Middle Ages is that they become involved in religious circles and Sufism, and many members of craftsmen guilds, on the basis of the guild itself, the whole guild will then become a Sufi brotherhood, and they'll get together for Sufi readings and recitations, let's say once or twice a week. And again, those a member of the political elite and who is a businessman, it all kind of gets mixed together, and people start wearing multiple hats. They're this and that and something else at the same time. Fascinating time, actually, just for that reason.
What was the role of ulema during Mamluk periods? Did they suffer financially and socially in these two centuries and a half, or actually they managed to flourish in urban centers?
They did, they did quite well.
Yeah, as usually, they always
Particularly the smart
they,
among
they always stick to the ruling power. Not only in Islam, but if we talk about other religions, the pattern is more or less the same.
funny thing. The clerics played a dual role because they married into the political elite. They see that the lives of their families and their profit and their careers are so tied tightly into the interests of the state. It's hard to disentangle one from the other. But at the same time, we have to admit that there were clerics who became the voice of a moral and ethical voice, and they were very critical of the regime. Um, one interesting historian of the later Mamluk period is probably the most famous, al-Maqrizi, who wrote this beautiful urban, we'll call it an urban map of Cairo. He loved his hometown, and he describes in beautiful emotional detail the various neighborhoods and how they developed. But he was a market inspector, and he worked for the state for a while, and he felt that his career was thwarted, and he was overlooked. And at a later stage in his life, he just sort of withdrew and became embittered and wrote tracts against the state. Whether you want to think of that as just professional sour grapes, or if he truly was becoming a voice, a valid voice of criticism against corruption. I mean, both are probably true. The person that has written the most about Makrizi in this sense is Nasser Rabat, who is at MIT in Boston. And he's got a book coming out, and there's wonderful wonderful articles that he's written on Makrizi in this sense. So the ulama, they're individuals, they're people. People are different, and as a class, their interests were served by the interests of the state. But as individuals, they could be very effective voices of criticism, and often they of the masses at large. One of the most criticized practice is the hoarding of grains, and the clerics took a very strong stance against that. They took a strong stance against certain kinds of illegal forms of sale of charitable land because it served their interests financially, but still it was a valid complaint. But I don't think there's one issue more than this one that generated their critiques of state of officials' corruption, and that was a hoarding of grains, of cereals during times of want and drought, and it caused many poor people dropped into poverty. Thousands and thousands of people died of starvation across the empire, not only in Cairo. It was a terrible practice, and it was a practice that was regularly done by state officials. And so it was the clerics that became a driving force to push the sultans to stop those practices by their own officials.
We have a record on different public projects, namely fountains, water canals, and what can we say about the water canals in Cairo and fountains? Because it was also kind of a way for officials to boost their popularity amongst the masses, or so-called Mamluk Street. Today we have Arab Street. At that time we had the Mamluk Street.
I'm glad you brought that up. That is a very important way that the emirs in particular engaged in local society. The medieval Islamic State existed for defense, not for building infrastructure. There was no expectation that tax money like today would be used for building roads, public services. It was up to people to do that for themselves. And most of that funding came through endowments. And among the most active of the financiers of public services were the emirs. And part of that was a desire to give back to their own communities because many of the emirs lived in the city. They lived in neighborhoods. Not all of them lived in the citadel. You know, they lived with other people in neighborhoods, and they wanted to see their neighborhoods thrive. So things like a garbage collection, um, uh, having water, providing water was one of the most important. Public education, providing courts, a court system in as many different neighborhoods as you could. Those were important public services. Soup kitchens, charity that is given through Sufi khanqahs and also through the mosques and madrasas. A lot of that money came through the charitable endowments of emirs. Now, of course, there's a vested interest there in those endowments. Yes, they provide important public services, but the emirs are able to protect their assets that way, so their money and their salary can't be taxed, and their profits can't be taxed, and then they can bequeath those businesses, or at least the positions as managers of those businesses, to their progeny. Among the most important of the public services by far is providing water. And so we have not only the emirs, but sultans. And Nasser Muhammad building his aqueduct. You can see it in old, beautiful old black and white photos of Cairo that show the pyramids in the distance. And then there's this aqueduct that divides Giza Plateau from the city of Cairo. It's a sultanic establishment, and you have many emirs that built smaller water systems, fountains, for example, or the Sabil Kutab, that ended up being a very popular way of donating money. A Sabil Kutab combines public education with a fountain, and the upstairs is a school for children, and then the downstairs is a public fountain. And I like to think of women taking their boys to these schools, and then filling up jars of water and then taking water home and then going to go pick up their boys and bring them back home. It's a strange little combination of two public services, but emirs were very active in building those kinds of things. You often found them on street corners because it's a tower building, and it fits very nicely in the corner where two streets meet, like at an intersection. And it doesn't cost as much money as building a mosque or a large madrasa, but it provides an important small public service for your community. And so the benefit, of course, is financial to the emirs, but it also gives them social currency too, and makes them popular to some degree in their neighborhood. So much so that whenever there were local conflicts, people might, instead of turning to the courts or even petitioning other officers or the Sultan himself, they would simply make an appointment with the emir that lives there, that is involved in their neighborhood, and say, could you work almost an alternative legal establishment, unofficial, because of their opinions and because of their power to intervene.
There's another significant inducement given by the Mamluks to the common people, and that was the opportunity to plunder the property of defeated emirs or emirs who fought in civil unrest and lost the battle. In Civil War times, crowds would wait for the official proclamation to get the green light and loot property of defeated emirs and enemies of the state. And we have lots of records on these looting campaigns in 1274 and in 14th century. There are plenty of these civil wars and conflicts that happened in 14th century. Was that the result of weak central government, or on the contrary, sign of strength of the central government, which manipulated with the feelings of different social groups and tried to also appease the commoners?
Yeah, another good question. I think that one have to very systematically go through the texts and compare those events of looting and pillaging and to see what the circumstances were behind them and to what degree the state got involved. One of two things happens there. Either the Sultan tacitly gives permission for the masses to loot. And it's a way of punishing without him having to lift a finger. He lets the commoners take care of punishing the descendants of a particular emir and his entire military network. Because he would have Mamluk soldiers himself. He would have his own Mamluks. So it's a way of removing an entire threatening network of alternative military power from the scene. Just let the people take care of it. So that does happen. But how often that happens vis-a-vis the other thing, I'm not really sure. The other possibility is that the state simply isn't in a power to reel in the people. They don't have the resources, or it's just so politically sensitive that if they sent in Mamluk soldiers to quell a riot, that they would be paying a much higher political cost than if they simply turned a blind eye to it. Both things happened, both tacit support and inability to quell revolts. And I think that you would have to take each one of these stories of revolt case by case by case. Now, something very interesting happens with the city cemetery in the 15th century. We have the Qarafa, and I think the Qarafa is one of the most fascinating districts of medieval Cairo. It's that 6.5 kilometer stretch of urban medieval cemetery that's to the east of the city, towards the desert to the east. And it has two parts. And the northern part of that cemetery used to be training and parade grounds for the Mamluk soldiers. And in the 14th century, the Sultan Nasser Muhammad decided to demilitarize that zone and make it a public zone. And then it became a cemetery, but a very special cemetery that developed into a suburb. Posh suburb of Cairo interspersed with tombs. And some of the political and military elites started to build weekend apartment complexes out there. And you had bakeries built there, and they had their own marketplace in the Qarafa and schools, and pretty soon it developed into a real bona fide suburb where the poor lived among the tombs and the wealthy also built out there. Well, if you can imagine, the poor and the wealthy are living kind of side by side in what's essentially the urban cemetery. There's going to be some conflicts, and things are going to happen there that don't happen in the city. And the amount of rioting and looting after the deposing of an emir or the execution of an emir was, that rate went up significantly in the 15th century. And it was a lot of the amiral properties in the northern Qarafa that got looted. And really, hardly anybody stepped in. That seems to be a green light for robbing and pillaging. And it was just a free-for-all because it's outside the city. It's sort of a free zone, a no man's land. You can kind of get away with things that you wouldn't be able to get away with within the walled city itself. The cemetery that became a suburb. And it's a tourist area now. Tourists, even foreign tourists, are often taken there. I used to take my students to the northern Qarafa because some of the most beautiful buildings, architecture of the late Mamluk period are to be found there. And they're well preserved. These are multi-service complexes, khanqahs and madrasas and mosques that also have bakeries and things like that attached to them. And emirs would live out there in the weekends. Women would go out to the Qarafa to picnic on weekends. It was an interesting place in the 15th century.
I think we can finish our conversation at this point. If you want to add something, you're more than welcome.
No, we covered a lot. Thank you.
It was nice talking again to you. We're going to continue discussing topics related to Mamluk period. I wish you a pleasant holiday, and hopefully we're going to see each other in Amman in coming months. Yeah.
I'm planning a field season in October, so we will hopefully be at Hispan in October, the first 3 weeks. Please do come by.
I'll come by to Hisban. Why not? Just let me know when you're back to Jordan, and we can coordinate. Thank you so much for your time. All the best.
Take care.